Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Suhair, Dr. Suhair Al-Alami. I work as an associate professor at Al-Alami University, Dubai. I would also like to introduce my colleague, Ms. Anjum Azeez, who also works at the same institution. Well, today we're going to talk about how to enhance writing skills, English writing skills via literature reading. As you can see in front of you, the outline includes the following: introduction, study questions, study population, sample setting and duration, conduct of the study, study variables, the proposed course, instructional approaches, criteria for selecting literary texts, study findings, and the study recommendations. Well, let me now start with the introduction, and I just want to say that this is a very long study. As such, we need to be as brief as possible. First of all, as you may know, especially those of you who live in the UAE, students are required by the end of the university journey to have acquired adequate communicative competence, which thus will enable them to communicate in today's demanding world. As such, students have to have an IELTS certificate or a TOEFL, and nowadays IMSAT, as all of you know. Now, I just want to talk about communicative competence in brief, very briefly, because this is part of our study. According to linguists and scholars all over the world, communicative competence is made up of 4 components. These are linguistic competence, discourse competence, sociolinguistic competence, and strategic competence. Finally, I want to now to proceed to talk about literary texts. You might be wondering, everybody, what does literature have to do with communicative competence? If you ask me, if you ask my colleague, Ms. Anjum, it does have a lot to do, everybody. Literature, what can be better than literature reading? Why literary texts? According to a number of researchers worldwide, Al-Alami, for example, Azeez, for example, 2018, 2020, 2021, Hadday, for example, 2012. Literature can be used to enhance students' communicative competence, to promote their language skills in general, to develop their critical thinking skills. What can be better than using poetry, using prose fiction to improve our students' communicative competence, so that in the long run, they will be able to communicate effectively, appropriately, and fluently. Now, I want to talk about our research questions. I'm going to start with the primary research questions. As you can see in front of you, we have 2 main research questions. These are, what are the components and the specifications of a fiction course proposed for promoting EFL university students' communicative writing competence? And here, everybody, there's something which I have not mentioned before. That is, this study is excluded to only fiction, prose fiction, meaning novels, novellas, and short stories. Even though we love plays, even though we love poetry, our study is excluded to prose fiction. So the first question is to do with the components and the specifications of a fiction course, the aim of which is to enhance students' writing skills, of course, in the English language. The second question is, of course, to what extent is this proposed fiction course, which we are proposing, effective in promoting EFL university students' writing communicative competence? The secondary questions, as you can see in front of you, are derived, of course, from the primary research questions. Before I start sharing them with you, I just want to say something, everybody. We had 2 groups, experimental and control. Normally speaking, the experimental group students were exposed to the treatment, that is to say, the proposed fiction course. Control group students, on the other hand, were exposed to what we usually had. And what we usually had when we teach communication skills, until now, by the way, is a general English course, meaning we don't have prose fiction as such. So we had 2 groups. As you can see in front of you, the secondary research questions are related to the differences in relation, of course, to the performance on the communicative critical writing competence pre-post test, which I'm going to talk about very shortly. And here we have also to think about two more variables. These are gender and a major type. The second secondary research question is related to gender type. Were there any differences, any significant differences between the male and female students in relation to their performance on the communicative writing competence post-test? And finally, what about the college type? And here the college type, by the college type, everybody, we mean science versus non-science. Where we teach, we have the engineering college with different majors. We also have interior design, and we have public relations and law. Let's proceed now to discuss very briefly the study population, sample setting, and the duration. As I mentioned at the outset of today's presentation, the population here is EFL University students. And if you ask me why EFL University students, because even though this study was conducted at Al-Alami University, where we both work, it is intended to target and address all EFL University students who are studying in the UAE, who are required to have an MSAT or IELTS TOEFL certificate before joining the university, and who, by the end of their university study, are supposed to have acquired adequate communicative competence. Since we cannot study each and everyone's case, we decided to choose 34 students who enrolled in the communication skills course, which we both were teaching at that time. And the setting, of course, is Al-Alami University, Dubai. The study duration, as you can see, is divided into 3 stages: piloting, which lasted for 1 semester; repiloting, which of course was based on the results of the pilot study; and finally implementation, which took place for 1 semester. And when I say 1 semester, I mean 16 weeks. Conduct of the study. Very briefly, let's talk about the participating students, faculty, and the rest. Participating students, again, 34 students who were enrolled in the communication skills course, which both Anjum and I taught at that time. The participating faculty were my colleague Anjum and myself. The study tool, actually there were 3 study tools: interview, questionnaire, and a pre-post test. With time limitations in mind, because we don't have enough time, a long time, let me say, we thought to only focus on one tool, that is the pre-post test. Research ethics, of course, we made it a point that each of the students who are there were happy and satisfied about being a member, and the students reserved the right to withdraw from the course at any time. And of course, the students' details were kept anonymous. A statistical treatment, we used the T independent test, and we also used Mann-Whitney test. Study variables, the independent variable was the proposed fiction course. The dependent variable was the students' achievement on the pre-post communicative writing test. And the moderator variables were gender, male versus female, and college type, or let me say major type, science versus non-science. Content organization, warm up, reading in action, warm up to arouse the sense motivation, reading in action to enhance the reading skills, because as all of you know, reading is a prerequisite for success in writing, in communication, in many skills. Language practice, and here we talk about grammar and vocabulary, oral production, speaking and listening, writer's workshop, which was intended to mainly enhance the students' writing skills, values in perspective. Each time we used to focus on one value, a value which was in a way highlighted in the literary text, building up your portfolio, which again can be seen as a collective student work and self-reflection. The instructional approaches which we employed were communicative approach, which, as all of you know, aimed to enhance the students' communication, stylistics. Here we are concerned with this, the style itself, and here we can talk about a linguistic style, and we can talk about, of course, a literary style. A process writing is considered to be a process which is comprised of 3 stages: pre, while and post, and eclecticism. You choose the approach that suits your students at the time, that suits them the best. The criteria for selecting literary texts in general and prose fiction texts in particular are language complexity, citing creation. The input we present has to be optimal, not too easy, not too difficult. Cultural appropriateness, we need to make sure that what is presented is appropriate in culture. Authenticity, it has to be authentic, not simplified. And here we need to think in terms of what students like, with their age in mind. Length, we don't want them to read a very, very long text, maybe. Values, again, to enable them to acquire a number of skills for lifelong learning and relative contemporaneous. Even though we love Shakespeare and Chaucer, maybe for today's demanding world where communication is required, maybe not archaic literature. The study findings in brief, we can say and claim that the proposed course was effective in terms of enhancing the students' communicative critical writing competence. When it comes to male versus female students' performance, we could find no statistical significant differences. And finally, when it comes to the college type, no significant differences. Study recommendations. Before I talk about study recommendations, I just want to say very briefly that this study was excluded to 34 students, excluded 2 instructors, so these can be considered the limitations. However, we still have a number of recommendations which we would like to make and share with you now. We would love to advise you, everybody, to use literary texts, in particular novels, novellas, and short stories, as a means for enhancing university students' writing skills. Why not poetry? Because prose fiction texts are the closest to everyday language. Why selection of literary texts? Think about what texts you want to present your students with. When it comes to selection of teaching methodologies, eclecticism. Choose what suits your students the best. Think in terms of what your students like, having their level, background level, language level in mind. When it comes to the writing tasks that you want to devise, you have to have a purpose. Each and every writing task has to have a purpose. We write for a purpose. It has to be authentic if you want to improve their communication skills. Fun has to be there to make them more motivated. Inspiration, think of something which will inspire them to succeed and communicate. And of course, motivation. When it comes to correcting written work, you have to have an aim in mind. You don't just correct it for the sake of correcting it. What is your aim here? Is it to test their knowledge about, for example, narrative writing? One thing, by the way, I just want to say about the test. The test was comprised of the three types: narrative, descriptive, and expository. Is it narrative? Then you focus on narrative. Is it descriptive? And so on and so forth. Common errors. You need to look for the common errors which your students make, and you need to focus on the error type. Does it have to do with vocabulary choice, diction, grammar, grammatical structures? And finally, you need to offer your students appropriate feedback. Without sufficient feedback, your students will miss a great deal. This is extremely important when it comes to correcting your written work, students' written work, of course. Thank you, everybody. I hope that you have enjoyed listening to our presentation. Thanks a lot. These are our email addresses. In case you want to email us, we would be more than happy and willing to answer your questions. Again, this is a mixed methods study, quantitative and qualitative. However, due to time constraints, we've decided to focus on the pre-post test. Thanks a lot.